A janitor found a sealed locker, and what was inside changed everything. The groan of the metal was a sound of protest, a rusty scream from a throat sealed shut for half a century. Arthur Jenkins, a man whose life was measured in the rhythmic squeak of his cart's wheels and the chemical temps of floor wax, put his shoulder into it. The crowbar, a relic from his own garage, bit into the petrified seam where the locker door met its frame. He was 63, with a back that sang arias of old injuries and hands nulled into permanent grips. But the stubbornness of this single locker 187 had become a personal affront. For weeks, it had been the silent outlier in the long, echoing hallway of Northwood High's Sea Wing, the only one still bearing the old pea-green paint from before the 1970s renovation. All the others were a sterile modern grey. This one was a ghost. The school was empty, swallowed by the thick, velvet dark of a starless July night. The only sounds were the hum of the ancient ventilation system and the frantic buzz of a fly trapped against the high window at the end of the hall. Arthur's breath came in ragged puffs, the air tasting of dust and something else, something metallic and faintly sweet, like old pennies and forgotten perfume. He'd found it during the summer deep clean, a project he undertook with the grim satisfaction of a man setting his own house in order before the end. The administration, eager to save a buck, had decided against replacing the entire bank of lockers, instead opting for a cheap paint job. But the contractors couldn't get 187 open. Its lock was fused, a single, solid piece of rust. Their bolt cutters had snapped. Their drills had winned and smoked, then given up. "Just paint over it, old man," the foreman had grunted, clapping Arthur on the shoulder with a sweaty hand. "Nobody's used that thing since before you were born," but Arthur couldn't. It was a splinter in the smooth, clean plane of his world. A question mark at the end of a sentence that should have been a period. So he'd brought his own tools. With a final, desperate heave, the metal shrieked. A sound that scraped down Arthur's spine, and the door buckled outward. It didn't swing open. It fell. It crashed to the linoleum floor with a deafening clang. That echoed through the cavernous silence of the school like a gunshot. Arthur froze, his heart hammering against his ribs, listening. He half expected the spectral footsteps of a long-dead principal, or the wail of a security alarm. But there was nothing, only the fly, still buzzing its tiny, desperate rhythm. He shone his flashlight into the black rectangle of the opening. The beam cut through a curtain of cobwebs so thick they looked like spun sugar, grayed with age. The air that wafted out was a physical presence. It was thick, heavy, and wrong. It was the smell of a sealed tomb, of decay that had been given decades to perfect itself. It was the smell of damp wool, of leather turned brittle and sour, of paper slowly surrendering to mold. And underneath it all, that same cloying sweetish odor, now stronger, more defined. It was the smell of something that had once been alive. His light found the first object, a stack of textbooks, their covers warped and swollen with moisture. Chemistry, the central science. Of Mice and Men, a history of the American Republic. The names were ghosts of a curriculum long since retired. Beside them, a girl's handbag, made of cracked white patent leather, the kind a teenager in another era might have carried to a sock hop. Its brass clasp was green with verdigris. He reached in, his fingers hesitating just before they touched. The bag, the air was cold, a pocket of unnatural chill that didn't belong in the humid summer night. He nudged the purse with the tip of the crowbar. It shifted, revealing what was beneath it. A shoe dot. It was a saddle shoe, black and white. The leather, cracked and peeling like sunburnt skin. It was small, a girl's shoe. Arthur's breath hitched. His light traveled upward, following the line of a faded bobby-socked ankle, the fabric now a mottled brown. He saw the hem of a plaid skirt, the wool eaten through in places by unseen mouths revealing glimpses of something dark and solid beneath. His mind refused to connect the images. It was a mannequin, he told himself, a prank. Some elaborate sick joke left by students 50 years ago. Kids were cruel. He remembered the things they did, now the graffiti, the casual vandalism, They must have been just as bad then, but the smell. The smell was no prank. He forced the beam of his flashlight higher, past the skirt, past the Nordat fabric of a cardigan sweater. The light found a shape, a human shape. It was slumped, folded into the narrow space in a way that defied the natural posture of the living. The body and his mind finally, sickeningly, accepted the word was propped against the back of the locker, its head bowed forward as if in prayer. Or shame, time seemed too slow, to thicken like the air around him. The buzzing of the fly became a roar in his ears. He could see details with a hallucinatory clarity. He saw a glint of metal on a desiccated finger, a silver ring with a small dark stone. He saw a cascade of hair, once probably lustrous, now a dry, matted tangle that fell across a face he couldn't see. He saw the skeletal curve of a shoulder blade beneath the ruined sweater. And he saw the other thing. The thing that made his stomach clench and a hot acidic bile rise in his throat. Wrapped around the neck, cinched so tight it was embedded in the mummified flesh, was a leather belt. A man's belt. The buckle, a heavy, ornate silver thing, was pressed against the side of the throat. It was shaped like the letter W. Arthur stumbled back, his legs turning to water. He tripped over the fallen locker door and landed hard on the floor, the flashlight skittering out of his hand and rolling away, its beam dancing crazily across the ceiling. The hallway was plunged into a disorienting twilight. The only light now coming from the dim yellow emergency lamps, spaced far apart down the corridor. He scrambled backward on his hands and knees, his palms scraping against the gritty floor. His eyes still fixed on the black maw of the open locker. He couldn't scream. The sound was trapped in his throat, a knot of pure primal terror. He was a janitor. He cleaned up messes, spilled soda, muddy footprints, the occasional grim aftermath of a stomach flu. He was not meant for this. This was a secret the school had kept, locked away in its metal heart, for 50 years. A story that had ended in this tiny, dark space. And he, Arthur Jenkins, had just turned the page. His hand, trembling violently, fumbled in his pocket for his phone. His fingers felt like clumsy, useless sausages. He couldn't remember the number 4911. The simple, 3-digit code had been wiped from his brain, replaced by the image of a silver W pressed into dead flesh. He finally managed to unlock the screen, his thumbs smearing sweat across the glass. He didn't call the police. His mind, in its panicked state, latched on to a different life raft. He dialed the one number that represented order and authority in his small world. It rang twice before a groggy, irritated voice answered. "What, Mr. Albright?" Arthur stammered, his own voice a stranger's, a reedy, high-pitched thing. "It's Arthur, the janitor. You need to come to the school now, Arthur. It's 2 in the morning. What in God's name is so important?" Principal Albright's voice was thick with sleep and annoyance. He was a man who valued his routine, his 8 hours, his sense of control. Arthur tried to form the words. A body, a girl. She's been in here for years, but they wouldn't come. The horror was too vast, too monolithic. How could he explain a 50-year-old murder in a single sentence? "It's the locker," he finally choked out, the words nonsensical. "C-wing. Locker, 187. The green one." There was a pause on the other end of the line. When Albright spoke again, the sleepiness was gone, replaced by a new tone. An edge of something sharp and cold. Something that sounded unnervingly like fear. "Did you open it, Arthur?" The question was quiet, precise, and utterly devoid of surprise. It was not the question of a man being told of a horrific discovery. It was the question of a man confirming his worst nightmare had just come true. Arthur's blood ran cold. The silence in the hallway pressed in on him, no longer empty, but filled with the weight of that question. It hung in the air, more terrifying than the body in the locker, because it implied knowledge. It implied a secret shared eye. "Yes," Arthur whispered, his gaze drifting back to the dark opening. The line was silent for a long moment. Arthur could hear the faint sound of breathing. A man on the other end of a telephone line, miles away, whose world had just tilted on its axis. He could almost picture him, sitting up in his bed, the silk pajamas, the perfectly ordered life. Now in disarray. "Don't touch anything," Albright said, his voice a low, urgent command. "Don't call anyone else. Do you understand me, Arthur?" "No one. I'm on my way." The line went dead. Arthur sat on the cold, dirty floor of Northwood High, the silence of the school now a living, breathing entity. The buzzing of the fly had stopped. The world seemed to have gone completely still, holding its breath. He was alone with a dead girl and a principal who already knew she was there. The injustice of it was a physical weight, crushing the air from his lungs. She had been here the whole time. Through decades of cheering pep rallies, of squeaking sneakers in the gym, of laughter and teenage angst echoing in these halls. Had been here, folded into the dark, while generations of students walked past, never knowing they were inches from a tomb. He looked at the locker. It wasn't just a crime scene. It was a monument to a forgotten soul. And Principal Albright's reaction was not one of shock, but of containment. This wasn't a discovery. It was a breach. A secret that had been kept for 50 years was now out, and Arthur, the humble janitor, was standing at ground zero of an explosion that had been waiting half a century to detonate. He had a sudden, chilling realization. He hadn't just opened a locker, he had opened a grave, and in doing so, he had unearthed a conspiracy that was still very much alive. The cliffhanger wasn't what was in the locker. The cliffhanger was why. A man like Principal Albright was more afraid of it being open than of what was inside. The flashing lights, when they finally came, felt like a violation. They sliced through the sacred quiet of the school, painting the lockers in strobing blues and reds, turning the mundane hallway into a theater of emergency. Arthur was sitting on a bench in the principal's office, a scratchy wool blanket draped over his shoulders by a young, earnest-looking police officer. The gesture felt absurd. He wasn't cold. He was frozen from the inside out. Principal Marcus Albright stood by the window, his back to Arthur, watching the circus unfold in the parking lot. He was a tall, impeccably dressed man, even now, in trousers and a hastily thrown-on cashmere sweater. His silver hair was perfectly coiffed, his posture ramrod straight. He looked less like a man whose school had just become a major crime scene, and more like a CEO surveying a minor disruption in the supply chain. He hadn't spoken a word to Arthur since he'd arrived, his face a mask of grim, controlled fury. He'd taken one look at the open locker, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly, and then had made the call himself, his voice calm, measured, and authoritative. The victim had a name now, or at least, a potential one. Detective Isabella Rossi, a sharp, dark-eyed woman whose gaze seemed to miss nothing, had found the white patent leather handbag. She'd handled it with a reverence that shamed Arthur's clumsy prodding with the crowbar inside. Amongst the detritus of a teenage life, a tube of pale pink lipstick, a dog-eared copy of a movie ticket for Psycho. A tiny silver locket was a student ID card, miraculously preserved in a plastic sleeve. The photo was a ghost, a faded black and white image of a girl with a bright, hopeful smile and dark, sad eyes. Her name was Eleanor Vance. The date on the card read, 1968, Eleanor Vance. Rossi had murmured, her voice soft. She was reported as a runaway, September 12, 1968, just vanished. Family moved away a few years later. Case went cold so fast it was frozen solid. Now, in the office, Rossi was questioning Albright. Her partner, a burly, older detective named Miller, whose face seemed permanently set in a weary frown, was taking notes. "You were a student here then, weren't you, Mr. Albright?" Rossi asked, her tone conversational, but her eyes were like scalpels. Albright turned from the window. His face was unreadable. "I graduated in the spring of '69. So you would have known Eleanor Vance." It wasn't a question. Northwood was a big school, even then, Albright said, his voice smooth as polished stone. "I knew of her. I can't say we were friends. What do you remember about her?" Albright steepled his fingers, a gesture of thoughtful authority. "She was quiet, kept to herself, an artistic type, I believe. always sketching in a notebook. She was fragile. He chose the word carefully, as if selecting a piece of crystal. Fragile, Rossi pressed. What does that mean? It means she was the sort of girl that people took advantage of, Albright said, his eyes flicking for a brief, cold moment toward Arthur. The implication was clear. The weak, the vulnerable, the ones who get left behind. Arthur felt a prickle of anger. He was just a janitor, a man who pushed a broom, but he knew injustice when he saw it. He had seen it in the casual cruelty of students, in the dismissive way teachers sometimes spoke to him, and he was seeing it now, in the way Albright was, painting this dead girl, this Eleanor, as the architect of her own demise. She was fragile. She was taken advantage of, as if her vulnerability was a flaw, a reason. And who, Rossi continued, her voice deceptively gentle, would have taken advantage of her? A shadow passed over Albright's face, so fleeting Arthur almost missed it. A flicker of something. Dark and ancient, it was a different time, detective. There were clicks, tensions. Boys will be boys, and which boys are we talking about? Albright gave a small, dismissive shrug. The football players. The sons of the town's important families. They ran the school then, just as they do now. They had a name for themselves. The warlords, they called it. Ridiculous, testosterone-fueled nonsense. The letter, the silver W on the buckle. Arthur's heart began to pound a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. He opened his mouth, to speak, to tell them what he'd seen, but the look Albright shot him was a dagger. It was a look of pure, undiluted warning. Be silent. The warlords, Rossi repeated, tasting the name. Any members you recall specifically? It was 50 years ago, Detective Albright said with a sigh, the picture of weary patience. Names fade. Faces blur. He was lying. Arthur knew it with a certainty that chilled him to the bone. The man's memory was a steel trap. He forgot nothing. He was protecting someone. The other person in the room who seemed to sense the lie was the girl. She hadn't been in the office. At first, she'd been brought in about an hour ago, found by an officer in the C wing, hiding in the shadows at the far end of the hall. She was a student, a current one. Her name was Maya. She was a thin, pale girl with huge haunted eyes and a shock of purple-dyed hair. She was a cleaner, part of the summer crew Arthur supervised. She was supposed to have gone home hours ago. She sat huddled in a chair in the corner, knees drawn up to her chest, her face streaked with tears. She hadn't said a word. She just watched, her gaze flitting between Albright and the detectives, like a cornered animal. Arthur had seen her around. She was like Eleanor, he thought. Quiet. Artistic. Always had a sketchbook. A ghost in the making. Rossi turned her attention to the girl. Maya, right. You work with Arthur. What were you doing here so late? Maya flinched, pulling her oversized hoodie tighter around herself. She mumbled something into her knees. Speak. Up, honey, Detective Miller said. His voice gruff, but not unkind. I forgot my art portfolio, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I came back to get it. I saw the light from Mr. Jenkins's flashlight. I heard the crash. And what did you see? Rossi asked gently. Maya's eyes darted to Albright, a flicker of raw terror in them. Then she looked at Arthur. A silent, desperate plea. Arthur felt a sudden, fierce wave of protectiveness for this strange, scared girl. She was a witness, not just to his discovery, but to something more. She was afraid of Albright. I didn't see anything, Maya whispered, shaking her head, her purple hair falling across her face. I got scared by the noise and I hid. Another lie. But this one felt different. It wasn't the calculated, self-serving lie of the principal. It was the lie of a terrified child. The night wore on, a surreal procession of forensics teams, photographers, and hushed officials. Eleanor Vance, or what was left of her, was finally removed, zipped into a black bag and carried out of the school she had never been allowed to leave. The hallway felt emptier, colder, as if her silent vigil had been the only thing giving it warmth. Arthur was finally allowed to go home just before dawn. As he walked out into the cool grey morning, Albright stopped him in the parking lot. The flashing lights were gone, the silence restored. It was just the two of them, standing by Arthur's beat-up pickup truck. Arthur Albright began, his voice low and confiding, the voice of a man offering a truce. This has been a shock for everyone, a tragedy, but it's an old one. A wound that needs to be cleaned and closed, not picked at. Arthur just looked at him, his mind replaying the image of the silver W. That girl, Eleanor Albright continued, she was troubled, she ran with a fast crowd, made poor choices. What happened to her was a terrible, terrible thing, but it was a consequence of those choices. He paused, letting the words sink in. Some things are better left in the past. For the good of the school, for the good of the community, for the good of everyone involved. It was a threat, wrapped in the language of concern. What about the belt? Arthur asked, his voice raspy. The W. Albright's eyes went hard. The mask of the concerned principal slipped, revealing the cold, ruthless man beneath. You saw a piece of rusted metal in poor light. Arthur, you're an old man who has had a terrible shock. Your mind is playing tricks on you. There was no W. Do you understand me? Arthur looked into the principal's eyes and saw the abyss. He saw the 50 years of silence, the carefully constructed walls of lies and power. He was a janitor. Albright was the king of this castle. Who would they believe? I understand, Arthur said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. He got in his truck and drove away, the rising sun glinting off the school's windows. He felt the weight of Eleanor's story settle onto his shoulders. He was a witness now, just like the terrified girl with the purple hair. He held a piece of the truth, a small, sharp shard of it, and he knew, with a certainty that terrified him, that burying it again would be a greater sin than digging it up had ever been. The injustice wasn't just that Eleanor Vance had died, it was that she had been forgotten, erased, and the people who had erased her were still here, still walking the halls, still protecting their secrets. The conflict wasn't over. It had just begun. The days that followed were a masterclass in controlled narrative. Principal Albright, with the smooth efficiency of a seasoned politician, spun the story for the local news. It was the tragic discovery of a long-lost runaway. A sad footnote in the school's history, a testament to a bygone era's less than perfect social safety nets. He spoke of grief, of community, of healing. He announced the formation of a scholarship. In Eleanor Vance's name, he was the picture of civic grace and sorrow. The word murder was never uttered. The official police statement listed the cause of death as undetermined. Pending further investigation, a bureaucratic phrase that felt like a second burial. The warlords were never mentioned. The belt with the silver W buckle was logged into evidence as a leather belt, buckle heavily corroded. Arthur knew, with the sick certainty of the powerless, that it would never be seen again. He tried to go back to his routine. The squeak of his cart, the smell of disinfectant, the familiar geography of the school's hallways. But everything was different. The building itself felt tainted, its silence no longer peaceful but conspiratorial. Every locker he passed seemed to hold its breath. C-wing was cordoned off with yellow tape, a long bright scar through the heart of the school. He would stand at the edge of it, looking down the empty corridor toward the space where locker 187 used to be, and feel the pull of Eleanor's ghost. She wasn't resting. She was waiting. He saw Maya in the halls. She moved like a wraith, her shoulders perpetually hunched, her eyes darting nervously. They never spoke of that night, but a silent understanding passed between them. They were the keepers of the secret, the only two people who knew the official story was a lie. He would see her in the art room, her sketchbook open, her hand still, her gaze lost somewhere in the middle distance. He wondered what she had really seen that night. He wondered what she was so afraid of. The antagonist, the force behind the 50-year silence, began to reveal itself, not as a single person, but as a system. It was in the deferential way the chief of police, a man whose campaign had been heavily funded by the town's elite, spoke to Albright. It was in the way the local paper printed the school's press releases verbatim, asking no hard questions. It was in the sudden generous donation to the Police Athletic League from a prominent local law firm, the firm of Walton and Price. The founding partner, Judge Lawrence Walton, was a pillar of the community. He was also, as Arthur discovered, through a few hours of scrolling through old high school yearbooks in the library, the captain of the 1968 Northwood High football team, the star quarterback, and the president of a student club whose group photos showed a dozen cocky, privileged boys in Letterman jackets. The warlords. One face in that photo stood out. A boy with a cruel smirk and cold, calculating eyes. A boy who, even in grainy black and white, radiated an aura of untouchable arrogance. His name was William Bill Albright. Marcus Albright's older brother. He had died in a car accident in the early 70s, a local tragedy that had cemented the Albright family's place in the town's sympathetic lore. The pieces began to click into place for Arthur. A puzzle of power, privilege, and fear. The warlords weren't just a club, they were the sons of the town's founding families. Waltons, the Prices, the Albrights. They were the future judges, lawyers, and principals. A girl like Eleanor Van Squiet, artistic, from a family with no money and no name would have been invisible to them. Or worse, a plaything. The victim, Eleanor, began to take shape for him beyond the faded ID photo. He found her in the margins of old yearbooks, a face in the background of the art club, the library assistants. She was never the focus. She was always on the edge, watching. In the 1968 yearbook, under her name, there was no list of accomplishments, no string of clubs or sports, just a single haunting quote from a poem. And so, all the night tide, I lie down by the side of my darling, my life, and my bride. He found the full poem in the library. Annabel Lee, by Edgar Allan Poe. A poem about a love so strong the angels in heaven grew jealous and killed the beautiful maiden. It was a story of love, loss, and a devotion that transcended death. Who was Eleanor's love? Who was the man she was quoting? The hidden witness, Maya, was the key. Her fear was too specific, too potent. It wasn't just the generalized terror of stumbling upon a crime scene. She was afraid of someone, right here, right now. Arthur started paying closer attention. He saw the way she flinched when certain students walked by. A group of boys, members of the current football team, who carried themselves with the same swagger as the warlords in the old photos. They were led by a boy named Trent Walton, a handsome, popular senior with a mean streak. He was Judge Walton's grandson. One afternoon, Arthur was cleaning the art room after school. Maya was there, ostensibly working on a project, but mostly just staring at a blank canvas. Trent and two of his friends swaggered in, laughing loudly. Double quotes. Well, look what we have here, Trent said. His eyes landing on Maya, the little ghost, still haunting the halls. Maya shrank in on herself, her face pale. Leave me alone, Trent. I hear you're a friend of the janitor, Trent sneered, kicking at the leg of her easel. You too, digging up any more bodies? Maybe you could find Jimmy Hoffa next. His friends laughed, a braying, ugly sound. Trent leaned closer, his voice dropping to a low, menacing hiss. You know, my granddad told me a story once about how some secrets are like sleeping dogs. You'd be smart to let them lie, especially when you live in their doghouse. He reached out and touched a strand of her purple hair, a gesture that was both intimate and threatening. Wouldn't want you to disappear, like that other crazy art girl. Maya froze, her eyes wide with a terror that was bone deep. He looked at Arthur, a silent scream in her gaze. Trent laughed, a cold, empty sound, and turned to leave. Clean up this mess, he said to Arthur, gesturing vaguely at the room. It wasn't a request, it was an order. An assertion of his place in the world, and Arthur's. When they were gone, the silence they left behind was heavy and suffocating. Arthur walked over to Maya. She was trembling, her sketchbook clutched to her chest like a shield. What did he mean? Arthur asked gently. What does Judge Walton have to do with this? Tears welled in Maya's eyes and spilled down her cheeks. They know, she whispered, her voice cracking. They know, I know. Know what, Maya? What did you see that night? She shook her head, rocking back and forth. I can't, he'll kill me. He said he would. Who? Trent, his grandfather, she sobbed, the words tumbling out in a rush of fear and confession. Judge Walton, he's not just a judge, he's the monster. The story came out in pieces, fractured by sobs. Maya hadn't just come back for her portfolio that night. She had been hiding. For weeks, Trent Walton had been harassing her, cornering her. A relentless campaign of intimidation that had escalated from cruel jokes to outright threats. That night, he had trapped her in the sea wing, telling her he was going to teach her a lesson. She had ducked into an empty classroom, heart pounding, and waited for him to pass. But it wasn't Trent she saw. Through the narrow window in the classroom door, she had seen Principal Albright arrive. She had seen him meet another man in the hallway. An old man, tall and imposing, who walked with a cane but still moved with an air of absolute authority. It was Judge Lawrence Walton. She had watched, hidden in the dark, as the two men stood before the open locker. She couldn't hear what they were saying, but she saw their faces, illuminated by the harsh beam of a flashlight. She saw the cold fury on Albright's face, and she saw the look on Judge Walton's face. It was not shock, it was not grief. It was the grim reptilian satisfaction of a predator confirming a kill. He had looked at the body in the locker, and he had nodded. Slowly, that was the secret she was keeping. Not just that she had seen the body, but that she had seen the men who were conspiring to keep it buried. She had seen the living ghosts of the warlords, still protecting their kingdom. Arthur felt a profound, sickening clarity. The injustice wasn't just 50 years old, it was happening right now. The cruelty of Trent Walton was a direct inheritance from his grandfather. The fear of Maya was a direct echo of the fear Eleanor Vance must have felt. The past wasn't dead. It wasn't even past. It was breathing down their necks. He looked at the terrified girl, her face a mess of tears and running mascara, and saw Eleanor. He saw the quiet, artistic girl who had been silenced because she was fragile, because she was in the way. And he felt a rage build in him. A cold, clean fury that burned away his fear. He was just a janitor. He had a bad back and gnarled hands. But he was a witness. And he would not let them erase another girl. He's not going to hurt you, Arthur said, his voice full of a conviction he didn't entirely feel. We're not going to let him. He knew then that his life had changed. He was no longer just a cleaner of messes. He was a participant in a war that had been raging in the shadows of this town for 50 years. The conflict was escalating, moving from the cold case of a forgotten girl to a present-day threat against the living one. The antagonist was not just a long-dead boy named Bill Albright or a powerful old man like Judge Walton. It was the entire edifice of power they had built to protect themselves. And it was up to him, a janitor, and a terrified teenage girl, to find a way to tear it all down. The humiliation of Trent's dismissal, the betrayal of the town's leadership, the danger that now clung to Maya like a shroud, it all coalesced into a single hard point of purpose in Arthur's chest. He had to find proof. He had to find the weapon that could finally end the war. The cruelty intensified, becoming a slow, grinding siege. It was psychological warfare. Waged in the whispers and shadows of Northwood High, Trent Walton and his cronies treated Maya like a pariah. They would accidentally knock her books from her hands, the pages scattering across the floor like fallen leaves. They would leave crude, threatening drawings on her locker, grotesque caricatures of a girl with purple hair hanging from a noose. In the cafeteria, they would surround her table, not speaking, just standing there, a silent, menacing wall of privilege, until she would crumble. Gathering her tray and fleeing to the sanctuary of the art room, the teachers saw it, or rather, they chose not to. They would look away, their faces pinched with a willful ignorance. They were employees of a system run by Marcus Albright, in a town run by men like Judge Walton. Their paychecks depended on their blindness. The betrayal was everywhere. It was in the averted eyes, the hurried footsteps, the deafening silence of those who should have protected her. Arthur became her silent guardian. He would make a point of cleaning the hallway where her locker was, his presence a silent deterrent. He would linger in the cafeteria, his mop and bucket a symbol of his watchfulness. It was a pathetic defense, a single, tired old man against a pack of young wolves, but it was all he had. He saw the toll it was taking on Maya. The dark circles under her eyes grew more pronounced. She lost weight. The vibrant purple of her hair began to fade, as if her very life force was leaching away. The antagonist, Judge Walton, remained a distant, terrifying figure, a puppet master pulling strings from his hilltop mansion. But his cruelty was made manifest through his grandson. Trent grew bolder, his actions more brazen. One evening, as Arthur was locking up, he found Maya's art portfolio slashed 2 ribbons, her beautiful, intricate drawings of fantastical creatures and haunting landscapes destroyed. Canvases were punctured, charcoal sketches smeared, a year's worth of her soul laid waste on the floor. Maya simply stared at the wreckage, her face utterly blank, as if the capacity for tears had been exhausted. It was a message: we can destroy what you love, we can erase you. For Arthur, the helplessness was a suffocating weight. He was a man of action, of fixing things. He could patch a leaky pipe, buff a scuffed floor, mend a broken chair. But how could he fix this? How could he mend a broken system? A town built on a foundation of rotten secrets. He felt the ghost of Eleanor beside him, her silent scream echoing in Maya's silent despair. He knew that finding the truth was no longer enough. He needed a weapon. Something undeniable, something that could shatter the walls of silence. Judge Walton and Principal Albright had so carefully constructed, he started digging. Not with a crowbar, but with the quiet tenacity of the overlooked. He spent his evenings in the town library, poring over microfiche, the grainy images of old newspapers swimming before his eyes. He was looking for a crack in the facade, a loose thread in the narrative. He read the original account of Eleanor Vance's disappearance. It was a small article, buried on page 6 of the Northwood Chronicle, a runaway. That was the story from the beginning. No mention of foul play. No mention of the warlords. He read about the death of William Albright. A single-car accident on a winding country road. Tragic. A promising young life cut short. The article quoted a grieving friend who had been with him just hours before the crash, a young Lawrence Walton. He was upset, Walton had told the reporter. Distraught over a girl. He was never the same after she left. The lie was so audacious, so perfectly crafted, it took Arthur's breath away. They hadn't just killed her. They had used her memory to absolve her killer. They had painted Bill Albright as a tragic romantic hero, heartbroken by the girl he had murdered and stuffed in a locker. The witness, Arthur realized, was the key. But Maya was crumbling. Her parents, seeing her distress, were talking about pulling her out of Northwood, of moving away. The Walton strategy was working. Erase the problem. Silence the witness. Just like they had done with Eleanor's family 50 years ago. Fear was the more effective weapon. Arthur knew he was running out of time. He started thinking about the locker itself. Locker 187. Why that one? Was it random, or was it chosen? For a reason, he went back to the C-wing, the yellow tape now gone, the space where the locker had been covered by a blank metal plate, as if it had never existed. He stood there, trying to feel the history of the space. He remembered something. From his early days as a janitor, a story an old-timer had told him, about how C-wing used to be different. Before the renovation in the 70s, it wasn't just classrooms. At the far end, where the fire exit now stood, there had been a small soundproofed room. The Audio-Visual Club's recording studio. It had been dismantled, the equipment sold off or scrapped. The space converted into a storage closet. An idea, faint and desperate, began to form in his mind. The AV Club. The artistic kids. The outsiders. Eleanor's crowd. He went to the school's cavernous basement, a labyrinth of forgotten junk and dusty relics. He was looking for the AV Club's old equipment. He spent hours sifting through piles of broken desks, outdated projectors, and boxes of moldering files. Finally, in a dark, damp corner, he found it. A stack of metal boxes, covered in a thick blanket of dust. Old reel-to-reel tape recorders. They were heavy, obsolete dinosaurs. Most were rusted and useless. But one, at the bottom of the pile, seemed to be in slightly better condition. He hauled it back to his small workshop, a converted closet where he repaired the school's equipment. He cleaned it carefully, his gnarled fingers surprisingly nimble. He plugged it in. To his astonishment, a small red power light flickered on. The machine hummed, a low, steady sound from the past. But he had no tapes. His search became more frantic. He combed the basement again, his hope dwindling with every empty box. He was about to give up when his foot kicked something. A small, square cardboard box, tucked under a pile of filthy rags. On the side, written in faded marker, were the words, A. V Club, Practice Reels, 1968. His heart hammered in his chest. He opened the box. Inside were a dozen or so reels of magnetic tape. They were unlabeled, except for dates scribbled in pencil. He picked one at random. September 10, 1968. 2 days before Eleanor Vance disappeared. He threaded the tape onto the machine, his hands trembling so badly it took him 3 tries. He flipped the switch. The reels began to turn, slowly, silently at first. Then, a hiss of static. And then, voices. They were young voices, tinny and distant. A boy and a girl. They were laughing. "You're not supposed to be in here," the boy's voice said. "If Mr. Henderson catches us, we're dead." "Let him," the girl's voice replied. It was a soft voice, but laced with a defiant strength. "I'm not afraid of him. I'm not afraid of any of them." Arthur leaned closer, his ear pressed to the machine's small, crackling speaker. He recognized her voice from his imagination. It was Eleanor. "You should be, Ellie," the boy said, his tone suddenly serious. "Especially him. I saw the way he looked at you today. After you rejected him, he's not used to being told no." "Let him look," Eleanor said. "Billy Albright and his gang of thugs don't scare me. They think they own this school. They think they own everyone in it. But they don't own me." There was a pause. The hiss of the tape filled the small workshop. "What's that?" the boy asked. "It's my insurance policy," Eleanor said. Her voice was closer now, clearer. "I've been writing it all down, everything I've seen them do. The bullying, the cheating, the way they treat people, the way they treated Sarah Jenkins after the dance. It's all in here, my diary. If anything ever happens to me, if they ever try to hurt me, I want people to know the truth." Arthur's blood ran cold. Sarah Jenkins. That was his older sister. She had dropped out of Northwood in '68. Their parents had said she'd had a nervous breakdown. She never spoke of it. She had moved away and built a wall around her past, a wall Arthur had never tried to climb. Until now. "Where are you keeping it?" the boy on the tape asked, his voice a worried whisper. "Somewhere. Safe," Eleanor replied. "Somewhere they'd never think to look. Somewhere close to me, always." The tape hissed for a few more seconds, and then went silent. Arthur sat back, his mind reeling. A diary, a hidden record of the warlords, crimes, a motive, and a personal connection that made the 50-year-old crime feel as raw as a fresh wound. Somewhere close to me, always. His eyes darted around the workshop. He thought of the locker, the textbooks, the handbag, the shoe. What else was in there? The forensics team had catalogued everything, but they were looking for evidence of a murder, not a motive. They weren't looking for a diary. He remembered the textbooks, chemistry, the central science of mice and men, a history of the American Republic. They were thick, heavy books. The perfect place to hide something small and flat. He remembered how they had been stacked, one on top of the other. He had to see them. He had to get into the evidence locker. He called Detective Rossi. He knew it was a long shot. He was a janitor, a crazy old man with a conspiracy theory. But he had the tape. "Detective," he said, his voice steady. "I've found something. You need to hear this." He played the tape for her, over the phone. The line was silent as the ghostly voices of Eleanor and her friend filled the space between them. When it was over, Rossi didn't speak for a long moment. "Who was Sarah Jenkins?" she finally asked, her voice quiet. "My sister," Arthur said. Another pause. "I'll be there in an hour," she said. "Don't let that tape out of your sight." When Rossi arrived, she was with Detective Miller. Their faces were grim. They listened to the tape again, their expressions hardening with every word. "A diary," Rossi breathed. "It could change everything." Getting access to the evidence was a bureaucratic nightmare, but Rossi was relentless. She called in favors, she pushed, she threatened. She cited the new evidence, the potential for a wrongful death case to be reopened as a homicide. Finally, late that night, they were standing in the cold, sterile environment of the county's evidence lockup. A clerk brought out a sealed cardboard box. Inside, nestled in plastic bags, were the contents of locker 187. The cracked leather purse, the single, pathetic saddle shoe, and the stack of textbooks. Rossi handled the books with latex-gloved hands. She opened the first one, Of Mice and Men. She carefully fanned the pages. Nothing. She moved to the history textbook. Again, nothing. Arthur's heart sank. Finally, she picked up the chemistry book. It was thick, over 1,000 pages. She opened the cover. The inside was warped from the decades of damp. She began to turn the pages, one by one. Page after page of scientific formulas and diagrams. Nothing. She was halfway through the book when she stopped. "Wait," she said. She ran her gloved finger along the edge of the pages. The book didn't feel right. The back half seemed thicker, more rigid than the front. Using a small knife from an evidence kit, she carefully sliced into the back cover. The cardboard was thick, but beneath it there was a hollow space. Someone had painstakingly carved out the center of the last few hundred pages of the textbook, creating a hidden compartment. And inside that compartment, wrapped in a faded silk scarf, was a small leather-bound book. A diary. The plot twist was not a sound, but a silence. The silence of a 50-year-old secret finally brought into the light. The full conspiracy, the web of cruelty and silence spun by the warlords, was lying in Detective Rossi's hands. The stakes had just shifted from the personal pain of a forgotten girl to a public scandal that would rip the town apart. The tension in the small, sterile room was unbearable. This was the weapon. And as Rossi opened the first page, her eyes widening at the elegant, looping handwriting, Arthur knew that the cinematic payoff was about to begin. The ghosts of Northwood High were about to scream. The diary was a bombshell. Its pages, filled with Eleanor Vance's elegant, cursive script, were a meticulous indictment of the warlords and the culture of fear they had cultivated at Northwood High. She wrote, not with the flowery prose of a teenage girl, but with the sharp, observant eye of a journalist. She documented dates, times, and names. She detailed incidents of brutal hazing, of academic cheating enabled by intimidated teachers, of extortion and threats. She described how Trent Walton's grandfather, Lawrence, and his friend, Bill Albright, had cornered Arthur's sister, Sarah, in the library stacks after a dance. Their threats so vile and specific that Sarah had dropped out of school and fled town a week later. And she wrote about Bill Albright's obsession with her, how his initial advances had soured into a possessive, menacing fixation when she'd politely rebuffed him. He saw her as a prize to be won, an object to possess, and her rejection was an insult he could not abide. The final entry, dated September 12, 1968, the day she disappeared, was the most chilling of all. "Billy cornered me by my locker today. He said he was tired of my games. He said if he couldn't have me, no one would. He grabbed my arm, his fingers like steel. I saw something in his eyes I've never seen before. It was empty. A complete and total emptiness. He knows about this diary. Someone told him. He said he was going to get it, and destroy me along with it. I have to hide it. I have to hide myself. I don't think I'm going to make it home today. If you are reading this, it means I was right. It was Billy, and Lawrence was with him. Don't let them get away with it, please. Don't let them forget me." The last 3 words were underlined twice, the ink smudged. As if by a tear, Detective Rossi closed the diary, her face pale. "This is it," she whispered. "This is the whole damn thing." The public explosion they had anticipated, however, did not happen immediately. The system closed ranks. The district attorney, a man who played golf with Judge Walton every Saturday, reviewed the evidence and declared it inadmissible. The diary, he argued, was hearsay from a deceased person. The tape recording was circumstantial. There was no physical evidence tying either Lawrence Walton or the long-dead Bill Albright to the crime scene. The official cause of death remained undetermined. The case was, once again, closed. It was the ultimate act of institutional injustice. A perfect 50-year-old crime, protected by a wall of power and influence that seemed impenetrable. Judge Walton issued a statement through his lawyer expressing his deepest sympathies for the Vance family and his disappointment that old unfounded rumors were being dredged up to tarnish the memory of his dear departed friend, William Albright. Principal Albright held a school assembly, speaking somberly about the dangers of gossip and the importance of respecting the legal process. It was a masterclass in gaslighting an entire town. Arthur felt a despair so profound it was like drowning. He had failed. Eleanor's last wish, "Don't let them forget me," had been denied. He saw it in Maya's eyes too. The flicker of hope they had shared had been extinguished, replaced by a resigned, haunted fear. Trent Walton walked the halls with an even greater swagger, his smirk a constant, silent taunt. He had won. His family had won. The system had worked exactly as it was designed to, but they had underestimated the janitor. They had underestimated the quiet, invisible man who saw everything. Arthur Jenkins had spent his life cleaning up other people's messes. He would not let this one stand. He knew the legal system had failed them, so he would take it to a different court, the court of public opinion. His plan was simple, audacious, and deeply personal. Northwood High's annual Founders' Day Gala was approaching. It was the biggest social event of the year, a black-tie affair held in the school gymnasium, celebrating the town's history and its most prominent families. The keynote speaker, the guest of honor, was to be Judge Lawrence Walton. He was set to receive a Lifetime Achievement Award for his contributions to the community. It was to be his coronation, a final public affirmation of his untouchable status. It was the perfect stage for a public execution. Arthur enlisted the only 2 people he knew he could trust, Maya and Detective Rossi. Rossi, furious at the decision and operating far outside her official capacity, was his inside woman. Maya, who had found a new fierce resolve in the face of the system's corruption, was his technical expert. For 2 weeks, they prepared. Maya, using her artistic skills and the school's AV equipment, created a video. It was a masterpiece of emotional devastation. It began with the faded black and white photo of Eleanor from her ID card, her smile full of hope. Then, it cut to images of the diary's pages, the elegant handwriting filling the screen as Maya's soft, clear voice read the most damning entries. The story of Sarah Jenkins. The description of Bill Albright's soulless eyes. The final, terrified plea. The audio was a mix of the original reel-to-reel to Eleanor's own voice, a ghost from the past and a haunting, minimalist piano score Maya composed herself. The video ended with a slow zoom into the Warlords club photo from the 1968 yearbook, the camera lingering on the smug faces of a young Lawrence Walton and Bill Albright before fading to black. The final image on the screen was a single line of text. What happened to Eleanor Vance? Arthur's role was logistics. As the janitor, he had keys to everything. He knew the school's layout, its electrical systems, its blind spots. The night before the gala, he and Maya slipped into the gymnasium. The place was already decorated, tables set with white linen and crystal. A large projection screen was set up behind the podium where Judge Walton would soon accept his award. Working quickly and quietly, Maya bypassed the school's AV system, connecting a small hidden laptop to the main projector. The video was loaded, queued up, and ready. All it needed was a single keystroke from a wireless remote. The night of the gala arrived. The gym was filled with the town's elite, a sea of tuxedos and evening gowns. Arthur was there, in his janitor's uniform, standing unobtrusively at the back of the room, a mop in his hand and a wireless remote. In his pocket, Maya was in the lighting booth, dressed as a student volunteer. Detective Rossi was in the audience, her face a neutral mask, her presence a silent promise of official action if things went according to plan. Principal Albright took the stage, beaming. He spoke of legacy, of tradition, of the great men who had built their town. Then, with a flourish, he introduced the guest of honor. Judge Lawrence Walton walked to the podium to a thunderous standing ovation. He was the picture of patriarchal grace, his silver hair gleaming under the stage lights. He placed his hands on the podium, looked out at the adoring crowd, and smiled. "My friends," he began, his voice rich and resonant. "To be honored by the town you love, the school that shaped you, is the greatest gift a man can receive. I look back on my time at Northwood with such fondness. It was a simpler time, a time of great friendships. I think often of my best friend, Bill Albright, a young man of such passion and integrity." Arthur's hand tightened on the remote in his pocket. He looked at Maya in the booth. She gave him a single, almost imperceptible nod, that as Walton continued to speak. Weaving a tapestry of self-serving nostalgia, Arthur pressed the button. The large screen behind Judge Walton, which had been displaying the school's crest, flickered and went black. The crowd murmured in confusion. Walton paused, looking over his shoulder. A flicker of annoyance on his face. And then it began. Eleanor Vance's face, 10 feet high, filled the screen. The gymnasium fell silent. The only sound was the haunting piano music and Maya's voice, clear and cold, reading from the diary. September 1st. Lawrence Walton held a freshman's head in a toilet for so long, I thought he was going to drown. The crowd gasped. Judge Walton froze, his face turning ashen. He stared at the screen, at the words written in a dead girl's hand. His own name broadcast for all to see. The video continued. Entry after damning entry. The story of Arthur's sister. The threats, the fear. Then, the audio from the real tape kicked in. Eleanor's own voice, tinny and ethereal, echoed through the silent gym. "Billy Albright and his gang of thugs don't scare me. They think they own this school, but they don't own me." People in the audience were pulling out their phones, recording. The public facade of Northwood's elite was cracking, shattering in real time. Principal Albright stood at the side of the stage, his face a mask of horror. Watching his family's legacy turn to ash. The climax of the video was the final entry. Maya's voice, trembling with emotion, read Eleanor's last words. "If you are reading this, it means I was right. It was Billy, and Lawrence was with him. Don't let them get away with it. Please, don't let them forget me." The video ended. The screen went black. The silence in the room was absolute, a vacuum of shock and horror. Then, a single person began to clap. It was Detective Rossi, rising from her seat. Then another person joined her, and another. Within seconds, the entire room, save for the few tables of Walton's closest allies, was on its feet. The applause, not one of celebration, but of catharsis. It was a roar of collective outrage, a dam of secrets breaking. Judge Walton stood at the podium, exposed and broken. The mask of the benevolent patriarch was gone, replaced by the face of a cornered, guilty old man. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. At that moment, Detective Rossi walked onto the stage, 2 uniformed officers behind her. She didn't have a warrant for murder, but she had enough for tampering with evidence, obstruction of justice, and a dozen other things. "Lawrence Walton," she said, her voice amplified by the microphone, ringing with the clarity of justice long delayed. "You're under arrest." The flash of cameras was blinding. The public humiliation was total. As the officers led the once untouchable judge off the stage, his hands cuffed behind his back, his eyes met Arthur's for a fleeting second. In them, Arthur saw not hatred, but a look of pure, baffled disbelief. The look of a king who could not comprehend how a pawn had just toppled his entire kingdom. The cinematic payoff was complete. It wasn't just an arrest. It was a public execution of a reputation, a live-streamed demolition of a corrupt dynasty. The secret of Locker 187 was finally out, not in a quiet courtroom, but in a spectacular explosion of truth that would go viral before the night was over. Arthur Jenkins, the janitor, had cleaned his final, most important mess. The aftermath was a quiet unraveling. The scandal broke the internet, just as Arthur had known it would. The video Maya made was everywhere, a viral ghost story that captivated the nation. News vans camped outside Northwood High for weeks. The story of the janitor, the art goth girl, and the 50-year-old diary was a modern-day fable of David and Goliath. Judge Walton, facing a mountain of public shame and a reopened investigation now backed by federal interest, did not stand trial. His heart, weakened by decades of privilege and lies, gave out. He died of a massive coronary 2 weeks after the gala alone. In his mansion, a disgraced king in a castle of ghosts, Principal Marcus Albright resigned immediately. He disappeared from public life, selling his family home and moving to an undisclosed location. His name forever linked to the crimes of his brother and the conspiracy of silence he had upheld. The Albright legacy was now one of shame. The town of Northwood was forced into a painful period of self. Other stories began to emerge. Other victims of the warlords and the generations of entitled bullies that followed them found their voices. A Truth and Reconciliation Commission was formed. The system, so long rotten, was being gutted from the inside out. For Arthur, life returned to a semblance of normalcy, but it was a new kind of normal. He was no longer invisible. Students would greet him in the halls, not with the dismissive nods of before, but with a quiet respect. He was the man who had unearthed the truth. He had given a voice to the voiceless. He had finally been seen. He'd reconnected with his sister Sarah. He flew to see her, and for the first time, she spoke of what had happened in the library stacks all those years ago. She cried, and he held her, the 50 years of silence between them washing away in a flood of shared grief and healing. In telling Eleanor's story, he had inadvertently given his own sister her story back. One crisp autumn afternoon, Arthur stood with Maya in the town's oldest cemetery. They were at a new grave, its granite stone, simple and clean. The school, as part of its public penance, had paid to have Eleanor's remains moved from the anonymous potter's field, where they had been interred, and given a proper resting place. The headstone read, Eleanor Vance 195-1968, a voice that will not be saying below the name, etched into the stone, was the quote she had chosen for her yearbook. The line from Poe that had so haunted Arthur. And so, all the nighttide, I lie down by the side of my darling, my life, and my bride. But there was another name on the stone, below Eleanor's. Peter Jensen 195-11968. Together, at LAS, Arthur had found him while searching for the identity of Eleanor's friend on the tape. Peter Jensen, a quiet, shy boy in the AV club. He had died of leukemia just a month after Eleanor vanished. The town had assumed it was from his illness. But Arthur, having listened to the grief and terror in the boy's voice on the tape, suspected it was from a broken heart. He was the one who had loved her, the one she was quoting. He was her Annabelle Lee. Arthur had used some of the reward money the national news outlets had paid him for his story to have Peter's grave moved here, to be beside hers. Maya placed a small bouquet of wildflowers on the grave. Her hair was still purple, but her eyes were no longer haunted. They were clear and calm. She was enrolling in a prestigious art school in the city, her portfolio, now filled with powerful, evocative pieces inspired by their journey, had won her a full scholarship. Do you think she knows? Maya asked quietly, her gaze on the headstone. That we remembered her. Arthur looked at the two names, side by side, united in stone after a lifetime apart. He thought of the silence of the hallway, the weight of the secret, the courage of this young girl beside him. He thought of the cost of truth, the lives ruined, the power structures dismantled. It was not a clean victory. It was a messy, painful, necessary reckoning. "I think she does," Arthur said, his voice thick with emotion. "I think she's finally at peace." They stood there for a long time as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the grass. The air was still, the world quiet. The haunting was over. But the echo of Eleanor's story, of the girl in locker 187, would linger in the halls of Northwood High forever. It was a tragic reminder of the cost of silence, but it was also a bittersweet testament to the power of a single voice, refusing to be forgotten. The emotional echo was one of profound sadness, but also of a deep, abiding hope. The janitor had not just cleaned a school, he had cleansed the soul, and in doing so had found his own.